All right. Hi there, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good Monday so far. We're going to go ahead and get started. First, thank you very much for joining the Nevada Department of Wildlife for our conservation education program today. Again, this is a family program and it's rated PG. Any profanity or inappropriate behavior will not be tolerated in the chat or question and answer boxes. All questions should be on topic, and failing to follow these guidelines will result in being muted in the chat or question and answer box, or being removed from the live stream as well. So let's just keep it fun and friendly and on topic today. All right, so just a quick introduction here before we get started. Today's webinar is the life of a greater sage-grouse. We are going to learn all about this iconic bird of the West, a little bit about their biology and their conservation status here in Nevada. My name is Nicole St. John. I'm an AmeriCorps wildlife educator out here in the Eastern region out of the Elko office. On the other end of the screen today is our moderator, Julie Gabrielson, and she will be helping me along throughout the presentation today, handling the chat box as well as the question and answer box throughout the presentation so that I can get all your questions answered for you today as well. Just a real quick little tutorial on Zoom in case we have some new Zoom users out there. You can see right now you kind of have a split screen. So you have my face in one corner and then you have the presentation in the other. If you use that little grayed out bar in between, you can actually make one screen bigger than the other. So whether you want that to be my face or the presentation, you can choose your liking there, make it a little bit easier for you to see. One more thing before we get started. In the chat box, if you click on chat, you can see the little gray box at the bottom gives you an option to respond to all panelists and attendees, all panelists. Let's go ahead and make sure that's clicked to all panelists and attendees. That way we can all see each other's questions and answers and comments in the chat box there. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and get started today. All right, so we're going to dive right into our first poll question today. For those of you who have never seen a greater sage-grouse in the wild, these are a few pictures for you. But with our first poll question, I want to ask, I'm curious who out there has ever seen one of these cool birds out there on the wild landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this polling. Feel free to answer and send your votes in. And this way we can kind of gauge where everyone's at with today's presentation. All right, looks like we're getting some good votes coming in. Give it another couple seconds here. Looking good. All right, looks like about 85% of you guys have voted, and it looks like for a majority of us, this is a new bird. So that's awesome. I'm hoping you guys learn a lot about this bird today then. So we'll go ahead and end this polling. I can share the results with you guys as well so you can see them. Get those shared real quick. All right. So just a brief introduction here before we get started. This is a greater sage-grouse here. We've got a male and then we've got some females in the other picture behind the male. This is an iconic bird of the Western landscape. They're most famous for their elaborate courtship or their mating display, which we're going to dive into detail in today. In addition, they're a high conservation priority across the Western United States. So they tend to be a focal species for conservation out here in the West and across the sagebrush ecosystems. Okay, so we're going to start from a very basic level as we dive more into the biology of this bird. We're going to start with covering taxonomy. So taxonomy is actually the scientific classification of organisms, and it's based on the shared characteristics that the species have and the families have. So organisms are grouped together into a taxonomic hierarchy, which you can see from this pyramid here. It's broken down into smaller and smaller units as we move farther down this pyramid, with kingdom being the largest and species being the smallest. So again, as we move down through each one of these steps on the pyramid, They're grouped together based on similarities through genetics or physical characteristics and biological characteristics as well. So for today's purposes, I have this little red bar here. We're actually just going to focus on order, family, genus, and species as we dive a little deeper into the greater sage-grouse biology. Real quick before we move on to the next slide, let's take a good look at this blue poster here, this Game Birds and Fowl poster. You'll see it's got the title Galliformes up there. So that's actually the order that the greater sage-grouse is in. And we're going to go into this a little deeper in the next slide here. But you can see all these similarities between these different types of birds. These are all different species, but the similarities among them put them in the same order of Galliformes together. We're not going to go into class today because it's implied that we're in the bird class, which is actually called Avis. All right, so let's start out with our first step, which is the order. So the greater sage-grouse is in the order Galliformes. So if you remember that blue poster I just showed you, the Galliformes order is made up of heavy-bodied ground birds. This includes turkeys, quail, ptarmigan, partridge, pheasants, all grouse, chickens, jungle fowl, peafowl, etc. So these guys are all similar in the sense that they're heavy-bodied, ground-dwelling birds. So if we break it down another step, we move into the family Phasianidae. So this is the family that the greater sage-grouse is a part of, and this falls under the order Galliformes. Galliformes is broken down into 5 different families, Phasianidae being the largest of the 5. It's a diverse group. So this family in particular is made up of 50 genera and around 214 species as well. So we're going to keep breaking it down level by level as it pertains to the greater sage-grouse. But as you can see, most birds in this family, Phasianidae, are considered game birds. So let's move down one more step into genus. So the greater sage-grouse is part of the genus Centrocereus. And this genus is made up only of sage-grouse. So within this genus, we actually only have 2 species of sage-grouse that make up this one genus, one being the greater sage-grouse, which we're going to focus on today, and the other being the Gunnison sage-grouse. So as a species as a whole, the greater sage-grouse is known as Centrocereus urophasianus. That is his specific species name. So that includes the genus they're in as well as the name that is specific to his species. So some of you might have a few questions on that other sage-grouse that's in the same genus as the greater sage-grouse. I'll just talk real briefly about him. So that's the Gunnison sage-grouse. They're overall pretty similar to one another, except the Gunnison was separated out in 2000 into a new species due to genetic isolation. You can actually only find that particular species in very restricted areas of southwestern Colorado, in the extreme southeast corner of Utah. So that guy is actually genetically distinct from the greater sage-grouse, which we're going to focus on today. He's got a few different physical and biological characteristics as well. All right, so now that we have a biological understanding of the species, we're going to move into the different stages of biology that pertain to the greater sage-grouse. First, we're going to go ahead and talk about his appearance. So this guy is actually the largest member of the grouse family. As it pertains to size, males are typically about 26 to 30 inches long and weigh around 4 to 7 pounds, whereas the females are about 19 to 23 inches long and weigh only about 2 to 4 pounds. So you can see there that there's a size difference between males and females in this species in particular. And that's actually what we refer to as a sexually dimorphic species. So what that means is there's a distinct difference in size and appearance between the 2 sexes. So you can see in that top photo there that I have labeled male and female, there's a pretty noticeable size difference between the male and the female, females which we refer to as hens. In addition, they do have some similarities still. So both sexes are generally large, stocky-bodied birds with smaller heads, and they both have these long spiky tails. Their coloration is also the same. They're more of like a mottled gray, brown, and then they both have that black underbelly. Where they start to differ though, is when you get into looking deeper at the males. The males actually have a black face and throat. You can see that prominent white chest there in that upper photo there. They actually have 2 yellow eye cones, or actually like little eyebrows that are distinctive only on the males. And they also have 2 bright yellow air sacs, which are located on their chest. You guys will get to see these a little bit later on, a little more up close. And those are used for their mating purposes. In addition to their sexually dimorphic traits, both sexes have special physical traits that are unique to the greater sage-grouse. A good example of this is they're well camouflaged for their habitat. So I want you guys to go ahead and this bottom photo here and feel free to participate in the chat here. But I'm curious, can you guys find a hen in that lower photo? She's hiding in that photo somewhere. We've got a couple people that have found her. Good work. All right, so I'll go ahead and click one more time here. And here's that red circle. So those of you that might have had a hard time finding her, no worries. These birds are built to camouflage in their environment. So you can see how well this hen is built to hide in this environment. So this is an example of some light snow out there on the sage, and where that modeling comes into play. So she's very well hidden and very well adapted for her habitat. Other cool adaptations that this species has includes some winter adaptations. For example, these birds are feathered all the way down to their feet. That helps keep them warm during the harsh winters. They also start developing a fringe-like structure in between their toes in the fall. That helps them have feet that act like snowshoes to get around the deep snow conditions and keep them afloat up top. They also have double shafted body feathers. And what that means is they actually have a rachis so that's the stiff part of the feather. And most birds only have 1 feather that comes from one rachis, but these birds actually have 2 feathers that connect to one rachis. And that's another adaptation to help provide extra insulation to get them through the winter months. These birds, again, are ground-dwelling birds, so they definitely prefer to walk, but they're surprisingly really strong flyers despite their large body size. They've got short, rounded wings that help provide an explosive burst of speed to get them up off the ground if they need to flush away from predators or anything that they see dangerous. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the habitat and range of the greater sage-grouse. So I have here a range map for you on the left. This bird ranges across 11 Western states and actually even into 2 Canadian provinces as well. This map here demonstrates historical greater sage-grouse range versus current greater sage-grouse range. And despite some habitat loss in there, they are still found in 11 Western states across the United States. In terms of their range, they rely on the sagebrush steppe. So that is a vast, intact sagebrush dominant ecosystem that ranges across these Western states. These birds look for a climate that's considered semi-arid, so that means it's got cold winters and hot, dry summers. And in terms of habitat, they look for a mostly open habitat, so it's mostly treeless, sagebrush dominated, as these guys are actually sagebrush obligates, so they rely on sagebrush throughout every step of their life cycle. So they really need to live in an open area that has plentiful sagebrush through every stage of their life. In addition, they like to have an availability of different bunch grasses out there on the landscape, different wildflowers, and wet meadows. So another term that we like to use for wet meadows as it pertains to greater sage-grouse is a mesic area, and that just means it's a higher elevation wet meadow. So those terms, I'll use both today. They're interchangeable, they're synonymous for one another. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this later on, but their local habitat use differs depending on the time of year and where the birds are at in their life cycle as well. So In the winter, spring, and early summer, typically find them in the drier sagebrush areas. In the late summer and into the fall, you'll find them more at the higher elevation in those mesic wet areas. And the goal there is they're searching for food and better water availability. One quick thing I want to point out here before we move on from this slide, you can see that I have the state of Nevada outlined in red. And that's just to demonstrate how much sage-grouse habitat we have here in the state of Nevada. So we actually have the second most priority sage habitat out of any other state here in the Western United States, behind Wyoming. So as you know, we're known as the sagebrush state. We've got plenty of sagebrush, which means we have some quality sage-grouse habitat out there as well. Okay, so let's dive into the greater sage-grouse diet real quick. So this guy is a ground forager, means he feeds exclusively on the ground. What they eat tends to vary with the time of year and the stage of life that the bird's in. So for example, these birds will make a transition from insectivore to herbivore as they become adults. So as a chick, they're primarily going to eat insects, and they do that because of the protein content that insects provide that helps them with growth and helps them put on weight. Adults will eat a mix of sagebrush leaves, various forbs, and other buds. And again, their diets kind of vary with the time of year. So in the summer and fall, they eat a diet of forbs. And then in the winter and spring, they eat more of a diet of sagebrush leaves. So real quick, I want to go ahead and pull up our second poll question today. I want to make sure to keep you guys engaged here. So you'll notice that I mentioned that they switch over the greater sage-grouse switches over its diet to sagebrush leaves in the winter or spring. So the poll question I have for you guys, we'll go ahead and get it pulled up here, is what percentage of sagebrush leaves do you think make up a greater sage-grouse winter diet? Go ahead and vote in this poll. All right, we're getting lots of good votes in. Keep them coming. Give it a couple more seconds here. Looks like a lot of us are voting 75%. All right, looks like about 80% of us voted, so I'll go ahead and end that polling, share the results with all of you. So it looks like a majority of us voted 75%, and the correct answer is actually 100%. So believe it or not, by December, greater sage-grouse eat only sagebrush leaves to get them through the winter. So these guys have a special ability to get around the volatile oils that are actually found in sagebrush leaves. So what gives off that pungent smell that sagebrush has actually comes from the leaves, and that is from an oil or terpenoids, which are found within the leaves. And that is a defense mechanism to keep herbivores from eating sagebrush leaves. There's a few different species out there, the greater sage-grouse being one of the better ones at it, that have a unique ability to get around that oil. And that's because they have a digestive system, which helps them separate out those toxins. And they're able to actually excrete those toxins in a special form of waste, which we refer to as a cecal tar. So it's actually a green-black tar-like substance that's actually separate from the other waste that they excrete. And that is made up primarily solely of the toxins that are found in the sagebrush leaves. So they've got a pretty cool adaptation to get around those oils that aren't good for other animals to eat in those sagebrush leaves. All right, so this is a little description of the annual life cycle of the greater sage-grouse. We're actually going to dive into each one of these sections a little bit more in detail, but just to give you a little overview here, an average lifespan for these birds is about 3 to 6 years. We are going to start out with Lekking and mating season, which typically begins in about mid-March and runs through mid-May, and this is actually the mating season where males and females congregate at historic breeding grounds. From there, we move into a nesting season, which is typically about late April through early July. There's a little bit of overlap with the mating season in there, but hens will mate and then go look for a spot to nest. Then we move into the brood rearing season, and this is about mid-May through September. This is where a hen is taking care of her chicks and raising them until they disperse in the fall as yearlings, or what we refer to as birds of the year. From there, all birds will make local migrations towards higher elevation mesic areas in the late summer and fall. They'll stay there until we hit this local winter migration, where birds will start to move back down to a lower elevation habitat into areas with plentiful sagebrush to get them through the winter. And from there, we jump right back into our Lekking and mating season. Birds will start moving back towards their mating grounds. So let's dive into these a little bit deeper. We're going to start with Lekking or mating season. So again, this is about mid-March through mid-May. And this is what these birds are most famous for. It's their mating dance or their mating behavior. So some of us are probably asking, what the heck is a lek? I've said it a few times now, and I know it's a little bit confusing. So a lek is what biologists refer to as a communal breeding ground. These birds actually return to that same breeding ground year after year. So this terrain is typically a little bit flatter and more open. As you can see in that top photo there, it's very flat. The vegetation is a little bit sparse, but they have some vegetation cover out on the edges where they can get out of there and hide if they need to. In general, these leks are found in the exact same location year after year after year, and these birds throughout their life cycle will return back to that same lek throughout their entire life. So males will strut or inflate and deflate those two yellow air sacs that I talked about earlier on their chest. That is a form of their mating display. And I'm actually going to show you guys a video of this right after this. It does a much better job of kind of showing it to you and giving you a visualization of it than it does for me to tell you about it. So don't worry, we're all going to get to watch this right after this. So in addition to inflating and deflating those yellow air sacs on their chest, they also display those yellow eye cones or those little yellow eyebrows that we talked about earlier. They also fan out the spiky feathers on their tail. And males will actually defend small territories on lek, fighting for the best position. That's typically going to be the center of the lek. And here's the cool part. Oops, we'll go back real quick. Females are actually the ones that choose the mates. So even though the males put in all this time and I'm pressing the females will actually choose who they want to mate with. And this is typically only about 2 to 3 males from the lek that will get to mate. The females tend to pick the best males on lek, and this ends up being about 2 to 3 males every year, and only about 2 to 3 of them get to mate. Typically, most females are done mating by about the end of April, but males will continue to strut and do their thing at the mating grounds through about mid-May. Okay, so here's that video I was talking about earlier. It's about a minute-long video, so I'll just go ahead and play it for you guys. I really want you guys to focus. You can really hear that large popping noise that they make with those air sacs as they inflate and deflate them. It's a pretty cool noise. You can actually hear it from up to a mile away. So I'll go ahead and play this video for you guys and let you get a chance to see these guys do their thing. Oops. Doctor. There we go. So here you can actually see those yellow eye cones displayed as well. He's got his tail feathers fanned out in the back there. Oh. I've just got word that you guys can't hear anything, so let me see if I can fix that for you, and I'll try again. Because it's way cooler if you can hear it. If it doesn't work out, this link here at the bottom is where I got this video from, so you guys can watch it on your own too. I encourage you to watch it. Let's try one more time here. Okay, looks like it's not going to come up, so I apologize for that. I will go ahead and give you guys this link at the end of our presentation today so that you guys can go ahead and watch that on your own there, because it's pretty unique and it's only about a minute long, and it'll give you a lot better idea of what the heck I'm talking about today. So we'll go ahead and fix that for you at the end. We'll just keep moving along today. Okay, so after we hit our lekking or breeding season, we're going to move right into our nesting season. So this is late April through early July. And as soon as those hens have mated on lek, they disperse and they leave those lekking areas in search of an area to nest. After the lekking season, the males have nothing to do with the hens or the nesting or brood rearing or any of that. They are out of the picture for the most part. So the female is responsible for all of the nest care. Nests are typically constructed on the ground under a sagebrush, preferably. In this top photo here, there's actually a hen and she is on nest at the base of that sagebrush. That is a good example of where these birds like to nest. So their nest bowls are relatively shallow. You can see in the bottom picture here, that's an example of a nest bowl. They're lined with grasses and leaf litter, and the hen will actually pluck out some breast feathers from her own feathers and use it to line the nest bowl and help with some insulation for the nest bowl. Generally, she has 2 escape routes on nest. So she'll have a hole on 2 sides of her nest, and that gives her an ability to get off the nest quickly in case she was to get attacked or something like that on nest. A typical clutch size for these birds is about 6 to 10 eggs in their nest. 8 tends to be the most common. On average, these hens will lay about an egg every day and a half or so for over a period of about 9 days. So after that, she has an incubation time of about 37 days. And the eggs are actually timed up so well enough that they hatch relatively close to one another. So she's not waiting on one to hatch while the rest of her nest is already hatched. Hens may renest a second time. So let's say their first nest was depredated, or a predator came in and ate all the eggs, or somehow the nest was destroyed due to bad weather. Hens will try to nest a second time, although it's not as common as in other species. Overall, there's a relatively high rate of nest depredation, or having predators come in and eat nests. Predators of nests include ravens, coyotes, badgers, foxes, sometimes even other birds of prey. A hen will also abandon a nest if she herself starts becoming depleted nutritionally. So if she just can't handle being on nest and taking care of it, they are known to just get up and abandon their nest if they need to. Okay, so from nesting season, we move into the brood rearing season. This is going to be mid-May through September. So hens will only have 1 brood per year. So once they have a nest hatch, that's all they have to take care of for the year. Sage-grouse chicks are born precocial. And what we mean when we say precocial is that they're born with feathers, their eyes are open, and they're ready to leave the nest within a couple days. So unlike other songbird species where you might have seen their babies hatch and they're naked and their eyes are closed and need some extra care, these birds almost pop right out of the egg ready to go. So after all the chicks have been born and hatched, the mother, the hen, will immediately start to move her brood up to those higher elevation mesic wet meadow areas. And that's again because the chicks only eat insects during this time. So you can imagine in late summer, up by water, you're gonna find a better availability of insects for these chicks to eat. These chicks are shown food to eat on their own. So they may not know what to eat right away, but the hen does a good job of showing them what they should be eating. By about 2 weeks of age, the chicks can fly, and by about 5 to 6 weeks of age, they're really good flyers. So these broods here stay together for about 3 months. So I've got 2 different photos for you here. The top photo, those are probably about 10-day-old chicks. You can see they're pretty small, pretty fluffy. In the lower photo, you can see the birds are a lot bigger there. Those chicks there are probably closer to the 35-day mark. That's 35 days after hatch. Overall, chick survival is actually pretty low. It's said that only about half of the chicks born will make it to their first winter. So not even make it through their first winter, make it to their first winter. And that's mostly due to the fact that when they're young and fluffy like that, even though they have feathers, they haven't developed enough of those waterproofing feathers to keep them dry. So if a cold, wet storm comes through, they're pretty susceptible to dying if they get wet. And in addition to that, predation. There's a lot of predators out there in the landscape that like to target these guys for food as well. So the last little step in their life cycle here is that local winter migration. So as we reach the end of the brood rearing season, these birds start preparing for winter. So they start transitioning their diet back towards the sagebrush diet. Again, by November, they're eating solely sagebrush to get them through the winter. So they'll start to make that local migration movement by late October or so, where they're moving back down to those lower elevation areas with plentiful sagebrush and less snow to get them through those winter months. Most movements in terms of local winter migration for these birds are small scale and on the local level, although they're completely dependent on conditions. So for example, there has been documentation of birds making 100-mile migrations south. In particular, this was a collared bird that biologists were able to track, and her migration was 100 miles from Canada to Montana, solely due to the snow conditions that year. She needed to find an area where sagebrush was up above the snow so that she had a way to eat. So she made a pretty large scale migration there to make it through the winter. So I have one more poll question for you all here. I want to know, we'll go ahead and get this pulled up for you real quick. I'm curious, what do you guys think? Do you think greater sage-grouse return to the same wintering grounds after year like they do their Lekking grounds? All right, we got lots of votes coming in right now. We'll give it just a couple more seconds here. Keep them coming. All right, we'll go ahead and end that polling there. So most of us voted yes, a little bit split on no and some unsures in there, and that's okay. We'll go ahead and share those with you guys real quick so you can see them. So these guys are pretty routine in returning back to the same wintering grounds year after year. So just like they do for their leks or their mating grounds, they return back to the same areas that they've wintered in the past year after year. So they show pretty high fidelity to those areas. Just a couple more quick facts for you on getting them through the winter. One little cool fact about these guys is they actually tend to gain weight in the winter, which is pretty rare for other species to get through the winter. That has to do with their strong winter adaptations in terms of keeping themselves warm and insulated, and the fact that they have plentiful food source. They have an ability to eat a food source that a lot of other species don't have access or the ability to eat. In addition, they actually tend to gather in large flocks in the winter. It's not necessarily for them to stay warm or huddle together for warmth. It's actually more of a ability to avoid predators. As you can imagine, more landscape out there gives you a better chance of getting away from predators. So as we reach the end of this period, we start moving back into about early March, and now we're looking at starting that annual cycle over again, where the birds are starting to move back towards their lekking or mating grounds to start this whole process over again for the next year. All right, so let's talk a little bit about greater sage-grouse in Nevada and a little bit about their conservation status. So here in Nevada, the greater sage-grouse is actually the most common grouse species you'll find here in the state. Other species out there on the landscape include the dusky grouse, the sooty grouse, ruffed grouse, and we even have a small population of sharp-tailed grouse as well. The greater sage-grouse, though, he's found in 15 out of 17 counties here in Nevada. So if you remember that map I showed at the beginning and had Nevada highlighted in red, that goes back to the fact that we've got a lot of sagebrush in the state and therefore a lot of priority sage-grouse habitat as well. So here in Nevada, the greater sage-grouse is actually a protected game bird. We still have a short regulated hunting season in Nevada, and that's in the fall. So in terms of conservation, there are a couple conservation concerns out there for this species. The first one I want to talk about is habitat loss. And here I'm going to refer to loss of habitat in terms of conifer encroachment. So if you remember, these birds rely on areas that are relatively treeless. And if we have smaller trees moving down in elevation into these flatter sagebrush areas, you can imagine that's not necessarily a habitat that these birds thrive in. Those smaller trees or smaller conifers tend to provide more perches for aerial predators. A good example is like an additional perch for a raven to maybe scout out a nest on the ground. In addition, they're facing some habitat loss in terms of invasive annual grasses. So cheatgrass is a big one, especially here in the state of Nevada. Essentially, it's a very invasive annual grass that outcompetes other native vegetation on the ground. So it's displacing those forbs and those bunch grasses that these birds rely on as well for habitat and nesting and raising their chicks. In addition, we also have some increased nest predation out there. Ravens in particular are a little bit problematic for this species. Ravens are a very smart bird and they love sage-grouse eggs. It's a delicacy for them. So in some areas, we are seeing an uptick in raven populations, which means that sage-grouse nest might be being targeted by ravens. In terms of a conservation history for this species, there have been past efforts to list this species under the Endangered Species Act. In the early 2000s, they were actually a candidate for the endangered species list. But in 2010, they were listed as warranted but precluded, which basically means they're put on the waiting list for federal protection. During that time period and up until about 2015, the Western states started working together to really work on conserving sage-grouse habitat across the West. And then by 2015, the Fish and Wildlife Service came out with a final decision, which was to not list the species. So, and that was due mostly to land use changes that were put in place and the ability of the Western states to work together to really conserve the species. It had reduced risk to the species' future. So it was decided that they weren't needed to be listed at that time. Currently, there's a review being done this year on the 2015 finding to just reevaluate the status and see if we're still in the same spot that we were then. So overall, it's still a species of conservation concern, and it's a species that remains in the spotlight of conservation issues today. So in conclusion, Again, this is a very iconic bird here in the West. When people think of the Western landscape, the sage-grouse typically comes to mind, and that's typically because of their elaborate mating displays. They've got a yearly life cycle that starts out with the lekking and mating season and moves into a winter migration, and then they repeat that cycle year after year after year. These guys are sagebrush obligates. Again, they rely on the sagebrush ecosystem for in some aspect in some stage of their life, throughout every stage of their life. They're a species of conservation interest, and currently there's some conservation strategies in place to prevent further need to list the species. So with that, I want to provide you guys with some additional resources if you want to look in and dive in a little further into the biology of this species and read a little bit more about their conservation status and their history. All of these are really good resources. I'll leave this up for a minute and then I'll go back to that video page so that I can show you guys the link for that as well, to give you guys a chance to actually watch that video since I couldn't get it to work for you today. In addition, I want to go ahead and open up any questions that may not have been answered yet. So I will go ahead and look into the question and answer box first.
You have a lot, Nicole.
Okay, that's okay.
You do have a lot in there.
We'll start with the question and answer box. And then if there's anything I missed in the chat, Julie, if you want to pull those out too, we'll make sure we get those questions answered for you guys. Okay, so our first question here is, if they're so rare, why does the state allow hunting of this bird and loss of the habitat, even with the conservation credit system? So with that finding, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife finding, it was determined that the species was doing well enough, and the states and the federal land use plans had been amended well enough to put a conservation plan in place to protect their habitat, that we could still have a very small regulated hunting season for this particular species. Okay, so we'll move on to our next one here. Are they in Reno? Right out, not necessarily right in downtown Reno where you're gonna find sage-grouse, but around the vicinity you will, especially just north of Reno. There's some good quality habitat up there for them. And down by Gardnerville as well is a good area to go view these birds. Okay, so I have a question here about wild horses. Do the wild horses reduce sagebrush? And if so, are there correlations between wild horse populations and lower greater sage-grouse populations? As far as I know, wild horses don't eat sagebrush, so there's no competition in terms of food availability with sagebrush. Where there might be some competition there is that horses need water on the landscape as well. And as you can imagine, those higher wet meadow mesic areas are attractive for lots of different species, not just horse populations, but wildlife species out there on the landscape. So there is some competition for those types of habitat. How do new males or females learn where lekking grounds are? And do they learn from older birds? That's a really good question. And this is actually one that I'm still a little unsure on, and biologists are a little bit unsure on. But what we do know is it's almost like it's ordained in them. It's just a historical trait that they have, that they know where to go year after year. And that's actually pretty popular in a lot of avian species in terms of their migration routes. It's kind of just ingrained in their DNA, and have an innate ability to know where to go. So what happens when lekking grounds are taken by development? So an example would be housing or urbanization. How do they adapt and find a new lekking site? So that's a really good question, because it definitely happens out there on the landscape. We do have leks that will just disappear. So if for some reason, like an urban area goes in too close to a lek and maybe it's too loud and the birds can't hear each other with their chest popping noises, leks will disappear. Birds can move to other leks if they need to, and we like to call those satellite leks. So if they need to move their lek, they will disperse and find a new spot if they need to. However, it's pretty rare, and the loss of a lek, you can imagine, is pretty tough on this species because they're so dependent on returning to these same sites year after year. So here's a question: why are they named the sage hen? And do the Blaycocks care? I'm not quite sure what that means. But sage hen is almost like a nickname for the greater sage grouse. It's what a lot of local Nevadans refer to the sage grouse as. Sage hen is just another name for the greater sage grouse. So how did they get their name? I'm not quite sure how they got their name, but that's one I'd have to look into. I'm not quite sure on the history or the origin of how they got their name, so I'll have to do some research on that one for you. Okay, so we have how many males are in the lek. So this depends on the lek. Biologists say that for a lek to be actually considered a lek, you need to have at least 2 birds competing. And so it depends from year to year. Sometimes leks will be high in bird numbers, other times they won't. I've been to leks where I've seen as many as 80 plus birds at a lek, and then I've been to other leks where you are lucky to see maybe 5 on lek. So it just depends on the number of birds out there on the landscape and the number of birds that are returning to that spot every year. So real quick, I just got a request to see that link for the video, so I'm gonna go back to that for you guys real quick so we can get that up and you can see it. And then I'll continue with your questions and answers.
Nicole, is there any chance you can post that link in the chat for everybody?
I can. That is a really good idea. Let me see if I can get out of it for you. Okay. Okay, so I just posted that link that should have taken you guys to that video I wanted to show you today. It's just about a minute-long YouTube video, and it's really cool. It's really unique and gives you a good representation of what we talked about today. Okay, so a few more questions here. Since the chicks are precocial, is there any conservation programs that incubate abandoned nests and release the chicks back into the wild? So I have not seen any programs that necessarily target the nest and take eggs and incubate them, but I have heard of some work where biologists will actually take small broods, so like take the hen and her small chicks and move them to areas where the birds aren't doing as well. And that has been an effective conservation tool for boosting population numbers in areas where their populations are a little bit lower. So I have a question here. I once saw a bird that looks similar to one of them. How can I tell it's a greater sage grouse? So as we talked about, we have different grouse species here in the state of Nevada, but those physical characteristics we talked about earlier are pretty definitive of and pretty specific to the greater sage grouse. The only other great sage grouse that's gonna look similar to this one is that Gunnison sage grouse. And the reason we know it's a greater sage grouse out here instead of a Gunnison sage grouse is because of where we live. Again, that Gunnison sage grouse is restricted to a really small habitat, really small range. And that's Colorado and Utah where you're gonna see that guy. Overall, again, they look really similar, but the Gunnison is a little bit smaller than the greater sage grouse. He's got some different feathers on the back of his head. And genetically, they are their own species. Do we know how many lekking areas there are in Nevada? I do not know that off the top of my head. Those change year after year, depending on whether a lek has come back to the area or they've had to move on and make a satellite lek. So I do not know off the top of my head how many there are in the state of Nevada. I do know that I had the opportunity to help some biologists with some lek counts this past spring, and I just was able to take a glimpse at the number of leks they had to go count and go check on, and it's a pretty hefty list, and that's just for the eastern region. So I can imagine the number of leks that the biologists have to count out there on the landscape is pretty high. Okay, so I have, do the males linger longer in the Lekking areas in case the first batch of eggs doesn't work out? So that's a really cool question as well, and actually one that I didn't mention, but female sage-grouse actually have the ability to store semen, so they don't have to return back to the lek if their first nest fails. It might take a little time for them to be able to produce eggs again, to lay in the second nest, but they don't need to return back to the lek. So the males stay there longer, just in case there's a female that's a little bit later in the schedule and hasn't mated yet. So the males are pretty determined to stay as long and mate as much as they can. Okay, so we have a question here, can they fly? Greater sage-grouse can fly. They're not meant for endurance though. So they can fly pretty well, just not so well over long distances. They're meant to be able to fly and flush out of an area if they're being attacked by a predator or need to escape. So except for the mating season, do males stay together through the fall and winter months, or are they solitary? So after Lekking season, males are kind of on their own. Typically, they're a little bit more solitary, but they might roost together at night in groups. They might even roost with the hen and her brood if they find her, but they don't have any responsibilities in terms of helping the hen take care of those chicks. So in the winter, it doesn't matter what sex the birds are, they'll all tend to congregate together. The males won't necessarily stay in a group of males. Will the greater sage-grouse eat normal bird seed that you can find at the grocery store? So that answer is no. These birds do not have gizzards, so they actually don't have the ability to digest and break down seeds and nuts like other bird species. So they're specifically herbivores. When they hit that adult stage, they'll eat some insects and buds, but they will not eat seed like other bird species. So sometimes when hiking around incline, we hear a low whoop whoop sound, which we associate with a grouse. This is in brush under wooded areas. I would assume that if it's in the incline area, that is likely not a greater sage-grouse. It's probably what we refer to as a blue grouse here in the state of Nevada. So that's actually going to be the sooty grouse out there. They lump the sooty grouse and the dusty grouse into the term blue grouse because they're so similar. They're separated just because of genetics. So the sooty grouse you're going to find in areas right on the border there, the California-Nevada border, specifically up by incline there. And the dusky grouse you can find in the eastern and middle part of the state. So what is the current population of sage-grouse? That I don't know. It changes. It's very variable year after year. And it's pretty hard to get an exact population count on these birds. Biologists typically do this in a couple ways to better gauge the state of the population on the landscape. One is through lek counts. So when birds are all gathering at one spot during that lekking mating season, they're able to actually count the number of males and females they have on lek. And they'll actually count each lek about 3 or 4 times and average their counts out. In addition, in the fall, when we have that short hunting season, biologists ask hunters to drop wings from the birds that they've taken into what we call a wing barrel. And that gives us a better way of aging and sexing birds on the landscape. So that's how we get an estimate of the populations out there on the landscape. Do dominant chosen males stay on the lek the whole time? And if they leave, do other males get chosen? So all males will stay on lek, whether they're dominant or not, because you never know. If, say, one of the dominant males gets eaten by a coyote the night before, might be their day, might be their chance to be that next dominant male in line and fight for the territory and the right to mate. So is it a SCP? I'm not quite sure what SCP stands for. If you want to message me in the chat, maybe I can better answer that for you. Is climate change posing a threat? So we are seeing some changes in terms of habitat due to our changing climate. And again, that goes back into the challenges they're facing in terms of habitat loss, in terms of conifer encroachment, and cheatgrass invasion. Those are due to some changes in the landscape and the availability of water on the landscape and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and check chat real quick.
Okay, we have quite a few in there as well.
Okay.
The first one was asking if they are mostly diurnal.
Diurnal, yes and no. You can see them at all times of day. Typically, it depends on the time of year though. So in the Lekking mating season, they're most active around sunrise. So the prime time to see these birds leck and do that elaborate display is going to be about half hour before sunrise to about an hour and a half after. That is the easiest way to see them, but I have seen them out during the day as well. In terms of feeding, yes, they are diurnal. They do tend to do most of their feeding in the early morning and then in the early evening as well. They don't really get up and feed at night. They tend to sit in one place and roost, make it through the night, and hope that they aren't discovered by any predators out there on the landscape.
Okay, the next one asks if winter area depends on snowpack.
Absolutely. So where these birds decide to winter is definitely dependent on how much snow is on the ground. Because remember, they need to be able to access those sagebrush leaves. So if they're in an area where the snow is really deep and covering up that sagebrush, it's not going to be a great area for them to winter in. That's when they'll make those drastic migration movements in search of a better area for food.
Okay, next is how far from Lekking grounds will they travel during the summer?
In the summer, so to nest, they typically move about a couple miles or so away from the lek to nest. And then in the summer, when they're moving up to those wet mesic areas, it can vary. So again, it depends on the water availability out there on the landscape, how far they'll move those broods. But they will move them until they find an area that suits them and an area that provides enough water and insects for their chicks to survive on.
What is the average winter flock size?
Ooh, that's a good question. It varies on the local populations. Some areas it's been said that you can find numbers of over 100 birds flocking together. So it just depends on where these birds are going in the winter and how the local populations are doing in terms of number.
Okay, somebody asked if when we collect wings, the hunter barrel wings or wing barrels, if they also pertain to a migration study.
Not as far as I know, because that's a little bit before that time, since the hunting season is in the fall, typically around September. It's a little bit before these birds are moving back and forth. So we don't get too much migration information from that. It's more of just the number of birds we have on the landscape and the age and the sex of the birds that are being taken.
Okay, there was another question about Round Valley area in Eastern Sierra. LADWP is trying to dewater the Lekking ground by taking away water allotments from traditional pasture lands.
Yeah, so I'm actually a little bit familiar with this project due to a past Sage-grouse project I was able to work on. And they have a field crew down there that is studying specifically this population and providing information to give to LADWP and the other partners involved in terms of making this final decision. So there is some active work being done in that area as it pertains to the greater sage-grouse population down there.
Have predators become conditioned to sage-grouse mating and nesting areas?
Yes, as you can imagine, if birds are frequently returning to the same area year after year, you can imagine there's some predators out there on the landscape that are pretty cued into that, know where to go, know where to look. I've seen quite a variable presence of predators out there at the Lekking landscapes. Coyotes tend to be a frequent visitor. I've even seen golden eagles out there attacking birds on lek. These birds have one thing in mind, especially during the Lekking and mating season, and you can imagine they're a little bit distracted. Looking out for predators might not be their number one thing they're looking out for at that time.
Okay, are they in any way related to turkeys?
Yes, so they're actually in the same order and the same family as turkeys.
And the last one that I know of is asking if you have any photos of the double rakies.
Oh, the double rachis. I don't have any photos of it. I know it's something you can find online though, and there are some other bird species out there that have the same concept. They might use it for in a different way, but yeah, it's called the double rachis, or like a double shafted feather. If you research that, you can find some photos of it. It's pretty unique adaptation. All right, did we get all the chat questions, Julie?
I think so. I don't think I missed any.
Okay, so let me pull this up just real quick. Okay, so again, unless there's any last remaining questions there, you guys can use the Q&A box for them, but I really appreciate all the questions. It's nice to see how engaged you all are and how interested everyone is. But if we don't have any further questions, I just will leave this up for another minute for you guys. Again, in the chat box, I gave you that link for the video I was trying to show you, and encourage you guys to go ahead and check it out because it's pretty unique. So with that, unless we have any last minute questions, I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys get going. I know we spent a good hour on here today, so I really appreciate you guys all being here today. And we're gonna send you a little survey here a little bit later on. If you guys could just fill that out, just let us know how we did today and how we can improve it in the future for you. So feel free to fill that out. And oh, we got one last question here. If the female is a hen, then what is the male called? So this is a question that none of us know. Biologists refer to the female as a hen, and I've never heard the male called anything else. So as far as I know, they're not referred to as a rooster or anything like that. They're just known as a male. So, all right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you guys tomorrow for our next webinar. Thank you.